Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. You thought flow was the point, that effortlessness meant grace, that the absence of resistance was the shape of excellence. But what if that wasn't the truth? What if the real subject of this essay isn't performance, but disappearance? Not as liberation, as loss. At its core, this is an essay about what it means to remain intact while being continually redefined by systems that reward your absence. It is not concerned with victory, loss, or spectacle. It studies the ethics of what is withheld, the ritual of survival, and the unspoken moral contracts that shape our surrender to tasks that no longer require us to be present to ourselves. The neurobiology is real. The chemicals sequence with elegance. The protocols deliver. But what vanishes in the act of coherence is not just friction, it's memory. It's authorship. It's the quiet, interruptive ache of meaning that used to slip between the gesture and the reward. This essay doesn't seek to resolve that tension. It seeks to hold it, to ask whether optimization in its most exquisite form requires the disassembly of the witness, to wonder whether consciousness was ever the friction or the invitation. And so the words that follow do not argue, they observe, they withhold. They lean toward a kind of ethical vertigo where effort becomes something other than exertion. It becomes a trace, a tether, a final attempt to remain inside the work without vanishing into it. This isn't a call to reclaim the self. It's a quiet attempt to notice its fading and to ask without insistence what part of you still remains when even your finest moments forget to remember you. There's always a moment right before it begins when something in the room goes still. Not quiet, just still. The air doesn't change, the lights don't flicker. But your awareness recalibrates, not toward concentration exactly, toward commitment. As if the world is waiting to see whether you will lean in far enough to vanish. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like blinking, like tightening your grip half a second before the motion starts. Nothing in your face changes. But inside, there's a narrowing, a soft pressure around attention. The edges of the irrelevant begin to fall away. Not because they were unimportant, because they no longer carry weight. And then you're in it. You don't notice the entry point until you're already past it. The transition isn't marked by effort, but by its withdrawal. There was tension. Now there's just velocity. There were options. Now there's only this. And the strangeness is that it feels earned, not chosen. As if something trusted your hands more than your mind and let them continue without checking in. This is what gets mistaken for mastery, or control, or passion. But what's really happening is subtraction. You have removed enough interference, enough signal about yourself that the body can proceed without asking permission. People call it skill, but it isn't that. It's compliance, not to another person, to the conditions. You have matched your nervous system to the architecture of a demand, and in doing so forfeited the luxury of inner friction. You still feel, but only what is necessary to steer. You still think, but only in gestures. You are still yourself, but less in the ways you remember, more in the ways that don't need remembering. And the more often this happens, the more it reconfigures your sense of identity. Not in terms of what you can do, but in terms of how little you are needed to do it. You start to wonder whether consciousness was ever required, or whether it was simply a performance of presence that now finally is no longer necessary. There's relief in that, but also something colder, because if this is what effortlessness feels like, then maybe the self was the friction all along. Sometimes it arrives as relief, not triumph, not transcendence, just the soft quiet of no longer being needed. You've done the work. The calibration is complete. The skills exceed the challenge by just enough. The world presents its narrow invitation, and your body answers before you even register the ask. This is supposed to feel empowering, but what it feels like is inevitability. You don't reach for flow anymore. It arrives on schedule. The task presents itself. You comply. The brain delivers its chemistry. The self exits. And what remains is exquisite functionality, not presence, efficiency. There was a time when you mistook this for freedom, a kind of post-consciousness liberation. No more doubt, no more hesitation. But that was before you noticed what else was missing. Meaning, friction, hesitation. Not the bad kinds, the human kinds. What you've gained in precision, you've traded in permission. You no longer ask if this is worth doing, you simply do. And the systems reward you with coherence, with speed, with small doses of neurochemical bliss, enough to keep you near, but not enough to make you feel fully here. And here's the strange part. You're not unhappy. In fact, most days you feel better than you used to, more productive, more aligned, more effective. But the part of you that used to listen for resistance, the one that used to stop mid-movement and ask what this effort was for, has gone quiet. Not absent, just overwritten. This is the future you were promised. Optimized, streamlined, harmonized with the task. But no one told you that clarity would cost this much coordination, that ease would begin to feel like submission, that effortlessness would require the steady burial of every part of you that used to speak before the work began. You used to believe that consciousness was the problem. Now you wonder if it was the only thing that kept you from disappearing into useful. You still perform, you still excel, but the space where you used to dwell, the one behind the eyes, the one that blinked and faltered and asked, is now occupied by something more elegant, something that no longer waits for you to feel before it moves. You didn't mean to leave, but excellence made your absence irrelevant. The chemistry tells one story, the life tells another. Inside your brain, it's elegant. Dopamine for pattern, norepinephrine for focus, anandamide for smooth transitions, serotonin to bind meaning to memory. It's all sequenced, choreographed, repeatable. The neuroscience is clear. The metrics are impressive. But outside where you live, the effects are stranger. You remember less. Not in terms of memory loss, in terms of event density. Whole periods pass with perfect execution and no residue. The work was done, the performance delivered. But when you reach back to feel what it meant, you find only structure, no texture, no rupture, no scar. Flow preserves function, but it edits friction. And friction, it turns out, is where intimacy hides, where choice lives, where the contour of a moment is felt rather than computed. Without it, even beauty becomes procedural. You begin to notice how often the best days leave no mark, how the weeks where everything clicked are the ones hardest to recall, not because they were unimportant, but because they left no edge to hold on to. And that's when you realize you're becoming archivally efficient. The self is being optimized not just out of the process, but out of the narrative. This is a kind of vanishing no one warns you about. It's not burnout, not dissociation. You're not in pain. You're just absent from your own memory. Not because you didn't care, but because the systems work too well. The neurochemical cocktail is flawless. But what it induces is not just presence, it is erasure without injury. A version of you continues, performs, succeeds. But the trace, the emotional debt, the sense of cost, is no longer collected. And over time, the uncollected debt becomes something else. A flattening, not of skill, of story. Your life begins to hold shape, but not thickness. Rhythm, but not interruption. And interruption is where meaning often enters. The unexpected, the failed, the pause that makes the line true. Flow doesn't pause, it completes. It doesn't ask what was withheld. It only asks, what next? And you begin to wonder, if this is the best version of you, why does it remember less than the worst one ever did? You don't return because something calls you back. You return because the sequence ends, the task completes, the timing slips, the chemical support recedes, and the self-groggy unfamiliar re-enters the system it had momentarily vacated. It takes a minute to recalibrate, to remember what you were before performance replaced reflection. You blink. You reattach your name to your gestures. You notice the shape of the room again. The edges of your thinking roughen. You feel friction return, and it's disorienting. Not because you're confused, but because nothing is wrong. Everything worked. You delivered. You functioned. The system you've trained did exactly what it was designed to do. But the part of you that used to narrate these moments, the internal voice that made sense of motion, has nothing to say. The words are there, but they arrived too late. What happened wasn't yours to describe. It happened without you, through you, as you, but not with you. And now you're left with residue, not emotion, sequence, not feeling, trace. This is what the optimized state offers, a removal of necessity, a redirection of attention from meaning to momentum, a replacement of interpretation with execution. And so you begin again. You don't doubt the value, you doubt the accounting. Because what made the experience so powerful is also what made it uninhabitable. There was no struggle, no rupture, no voice arguing back. Just action, coherent, directed, refined. But even refinement has a cost. You used to be able to feel the outlines of yourself during the work. Now the work feels like an outline of what remains when you step aside. It's not pain, it's not loss, it's a rehearsal of vanishing that keeps getting closer to permanence. There's a silence that follows, not the absence of noise, but the absence of needing to know who did the work. The task is finished, the system is intact, and yet something lingers, not as memory, as displacement. You were not quite there, and yet everything happened. This isn't new. You've repeated the process hundreds of times. You've learned how to enter it. You've learned how to extend it. You've even learned how to disguise its aftermath, so no one sees the ghost returning to inhabit the body. But the feeling accumulates, not like fatigue, more like a soft misalignment between the actions you execute and the meaning that used to trail behind them. You've become too fluid to grip, too conditioned to pause, too synchronized to declare intention, and still, it's effective. There is no argument against its utility. Your performance is better, your output cleaner, your body, in coordination with its chemistry, continues to deliver the outcomes you once struggled to imagine. But each time you come back, something feels harder to reattach. The thoughts are there, but slower to reassemble. The emotions muted, as if translated from another language you once knew, but stopped speaking aloud. You begin to suspect that your life, as it has been designed around this state, is increasingly structured not around attention, but around its erasure. And this erasure is gentle. It asks nothing of you. It rewards you with clarity. It removes the burdens of doubt, of contradiction, of moral hesitation. It replaces them with rhythm. But rhythm is not the same as return. What you miss, if you let yourself notice, is the unevenness, the moments that failed to resolve, the gesture that didn't land, the effort that didn't disappear but insisted on being felt. You miss the ache of presence that didn't optimize itself away. You miss remembering what it felt like to stay inside the work without vanishing. You miss needing to be there. And maybe that's what effort was always for, not to achieve, but to tether you to what cannot be completed. You pause, not because you're done, because something didn't follow, something that should have returned with you. You reach for the words and find the gesture instead. It stutters. Not everything withheld was earned. Not every silence is consent. And you don't know if you'll vanish again. But this time you notice that you stayed just long enough to ask. You don't reach for flow because it feels good. You reach for it because it works, because it removes the need to negotiate with yourself, because it replaces hesitation with certainty. But certainty over time dulls something more essential than doubt. It dulls the moral signal that something has been traded. You didn't intend to become obedient. You intended to become excellent. But the structure doesn't care about intention. It cares about compliance, about the reduction of internal noise, about sequence without resistance. And that's what you've become. Sequenced. Not controlled. Just streamlined to the point that refusal no longer arises. You still have preferences, but you no longer ask them to interrupt performance. You still have values, but they arrive after the task is done. Like cleanup, like recovery, like memory being applied retroactively to something already delivered. This isn't dehumanization, it's refinement. You've removed the heat, the ache, the internal talk that made the work personal. And in its place is grace. You can almost believe it's better this way, cleaner, kinder, easier to live with. Until something small, an unexpected pause, an unplanned gesture, a broken line, reminds you what it once felt like to be inside a moment that didn't fit. Not broken, just unresolved, not failed, just alive in a way that didn't need to be corrected. You miss that, not the struggle. The asymmetry, the part of you that used to slow down just long enough to notice what didn't belong and love it anyway. Flow doesn't love. It arranges, it integrates, it completes. And in that completion, it leaves no trace of who you were when the work still needed you. You thought effort was a problem to be solved, that friction was inefficiency, that anything unresolved was a flaw in the system. But now, in the quiet that follows so much clean execution, you start to feel what was really being protected, the incomplete, the part of you that didn't scale, that didn't optimize, that interrupted the rhythm, not because it failed, but because it meant something too much to be folded in. This isn't nostalgia, it's recognition. That effort, in its unrefined state, was never just about progress. It was about presence, about the cost of staying close to what couldn't be resolved, about being willing to remain inside a moment, not because it moved forward, but because it held something that didn't move at all. Flow doesn't hold, it passes. And the more you train for it, the more your life begins to resemble a kind of perfection that doesn't include you, the real you, the one who stutters, the one who doubts. The one who pauses not to reset, but to feel. You're not broken. You're just not being requested anymore. The system has no quarrel with you. It simply learned how to proceed without requiring the full complexity of your presence. And yet something remains. A trace of unsequenced breath. A fragment of a sentence that won't align. A refusal to exit the moment just because the chemistry says you can. You stay. Not long. Not loudly. But long enough to feel the difference between vanishing and being quiet. Long enough to remember that effort wasn't the obstacle. It was the invitation. And maybe someone sees it. Someone who doesn't name it, doesn't ask, but notices that you stayed, that the sentence didn't finish, that something was held open even when nothing demanded it. You pause, not because you're done, because something didn't follow, something that should have returned with you. You reach for the words and find the gesture instead. It stutters. Not everything withheld was earned. Not every silence is consent. A sound behind you, barely a shift. Someone breathing, maybe listening, maybe not. You don't turn. You don't know if you'll vanish again. But this time you stayed just long enough to feel it didn't want to end here. And the next line that was supposed to come, it doesn't. You let it hang. You let it mean something. Or maybe nothing. You don't write it down.